This is our final dip into the Psalm. Psalm 4. It's a short one. It's 8 verses. Let me read. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your hearts on your beds and be silent. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, who will show us some good? Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. You have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. In peace I will both lie down and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. Let's pray. Father, we just ask for your leadership in this time. Will you speak through your word? Will you speak through your living word, Father? Thank you again. And may we be always just focused on you, Lord. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. There can be nothing more disagreeable to humanity than false accusation, right? I think some of your kids are like this. I've seen it. And in my mentor's kid, he cannot take false accusation, right? If you blame him for something and he didn't do it, he will absolutely go ballistic. Some kids are like this, right? They absolutely love justice. They hate injustice, especially when it's done to them. And I think whether or not, whatever personality that you have, whatever characteristic you have, you all understand this to one form or another. We don't like it when people falsely accuse us. We don't like it when people are incorrectly slandered. We don't like it when people pay for crimes that they didn't commit. Right? And so we have this vehement reaction to injustice. Let me tell you about a story about a man named Glenn Ford. As of April this year, there have been 159 exonerations from death row in the United States. As of April, these people are charged. Basically, what it is, you're charged of a major crime, and then you're committed to the death penalty. And then while you're waiting for the things to happen, you get cleared of the charges. 159 times since April in the history of the United States. A couple of years ago, I think it was like 2015 or something like that, 60 Minutes, they did a piece on a man named Glenn Ford. Back in 1983 in Louisiana, a local jeweler was robbed and he was murdered. And so the prosecutors zeroed in on this guy, Glenn Ford. Ford had done some yard work for the jeweler, and he also had a record of being a petty thief. In fact, it turns out that Ford might have stolen some and pawned some jewelry from the guy who died, who got murdered, the jeweler that got murdered. So he was a primary suspect. The description of the case, if you read it, like just a brief bullet points, it really makes it sound like a movie. It really is, if you think about it. A young, ambitious prosecutor, right, that wants to win trials so that he can move up and make a name for himself. And Glenn Ford was court-appointed, a inexperienced defense lawyer. They don't practice law. This is really like a John Grisham novel. Glenn Ford is black, and he's convicted of murder. Guess what his jury was? All white. It's literally like it's a movie. It's a movie. Records show that the jury took less than 3 hours to deliberate. Everything's over, the trial is over, and then they go back. And sometimes they spend like 11 hours, like 3 days just stuck in there because they couldn't agree. They spent 3 hours, and they found him guilty. And then so they charged him. Glenn Ford spent 1983 to 2013, he spent 30 years on death row, but he was exonerated. He didn't do it. Sad. The quote from him, he says, my sons, when I left, were babies, and now they have babies. And so, I remember reading the story. But call me callous, but stories like this are heartbreaking, but it's not surprising, right? I mean, stuff like this happens throughout life, throughout our society. It happens all the time. Even though, obviously none of us have been accused of a major crime, have never been put in prison for death row, we can all understand like a small part of that, right? Like it's like when we're accused of something, the injustice. Think about that story, what I said to you, and then how vehement that is against you, how sad that is to hear. And if we expand false accusation, right, into hate or prejudice or racism or bias or injustice or any of that stuff, I think we can all sympathize, right? We've all endured some form like this, obviously not to this degree, right? But we can all understand. In our message today, in our passage today, David is writing about a situation like this. That's pretty much what it is. Before we move on, I want to make things clear of what the text says. This isn't some generic Christian thing. This is what he's not talking about some generic difficulty. David's not talking about some ups and downs of life. David's not talking about sin and sin brings on certain things, right? This is what he's talking about. Look at verse 2. The exact nature is not specified, but it has to do with his honor, right? His honor is assailed. His honor is being brought to shame, the reputation of David. From the text, it seems that David is innocent. He did nothing wrong. He didn't do anything to these people that are accusing him, these people that are bringing injustice and lying about him. Have you ever felt like this? I think we've all felt like this, right? Like in various degrees or another, you feel like this. What? Me? What did I do? You ever had that reaction of you're like, oh my gosh, why are you treating me this way? Why are you doing this? Why are you saying that? I wasn't even there. Or we say stuff like that, right? When we get wrong, especially when we're innocent and we get wrong, what do? What's the first thing we do? Natural human instinct. We complain. Right? We call up our friends. It's our friends. It's not random people, because random people don't want to hear anything you got to say, right? But your friends are like, yeah, who is that? Oh my gosh, I can't believe they did that, right? Because they're naturally your ally. We complain. And then we complain, and then how's the conversation go? We end up bad-mouthing that person, right? It's ridiculous. How could you say that about me? Are you serious? You know what I do? You know how much I care and how much effort I put in, and you're going to say that about me? We always do that, right? Or, you know what we do? We shell up, right? We put up wall after wall after wall, and you know what we're going to do? You know what you're going to do? You're going to earn it. You're going to earn my trust. You're not going to get in. So you're going to have to go through some stuff to prove to me that I can trust you, because I've lost faith in entire humanity. No one can be trusted, right? We do one of two things usually. We usually do both, right? I guess in a way, right? Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, that's shame on you. I'm not going to let you do that again, right? That's what we do. So we complain and we shell up. But when you think about those ideas, is that really biblical? You know what I'm saying? Like, we talk about the hope of Christ. We talk about the empowerment of the Spirit. We talk about how God infuses you with this confidence and all this stuff. And so but in times of innocence, this is what we're going to do. We're just going to shell up. We're going to, be scared. How do we face times like this? When we are innocent, when we've done nothing wrong, and people accuse us of it, what do we do? Many Christians misunderstand what the Bible teaches about injustice, right? Some react too emotionally. They carve out everything, and then they go wildly, and they're like, oh, I can't believe this. I have no faith in you anymore. I hate you so much. And they go through these wild emotions, right? And then you're like, calm down, relax. Right? I mean, some instances is like, yeah, it's serious, but we all have to calm down. Jesus is our rock, right? Jesus is our anchor. There's all these imagery in the Bible. What does rock and anchor have to do with your wild swings of emotion? I don't think that's wrong. I don't think that's right either, right? But some people go the opposite way, right? They kill their emotions. There's nothing. They feel nothing. They're impervious because they've deadened their emotions, so that when bad stuff happens, you're like, that's life. Oh, that's church. Group of people together as sinners. What do you expect? And so they deaden themselves. That's not biblical living. Both ways are not biblical living. Wildly emotional, that's not good. But killing your emotions, that's not good either. So what does the Bible teach about these kind of instances of how we protect ourselves? This is what I want to get to today. So the natural question is, well, what does God want us to do? What does the Bible teach? In times of innocence and when injustice happens. How do we respond to injustice? 3 things of this psalm. If you're writing notes, this is how we're going to order this. 3 things. Why does injustice happen? Right? We're going to go some background information. Why does injustice happen? Why do we get accused? Why do innocent people get blamed? Right? And 2, how should we respond? There's some specific points that David does that we can emulate. This is not an exhaustive thing, but David does some things that are important. And then, basically, I want to give you the bottom line. What is the bottom line? What is the remedy for injustice, right? If we're playing Uno, it's a draw 4 card. It is like, it trumps everything, all right? And so, what is the remedy for injustice? 3 things. Why does injustice happen? How should we respond to injustice? And what is basically the remedy for injustice? All right? So first thing, why does injustice happen? Simply put, injustice happens because we live in a sinful world. That's what it is. We live in a sinful world. We live in a world that is devoid of God, and our relationship to Him has been broken. That's pretty much why injustice happens. Let me break this down even further. At the end of Genesis 2, God establishes an order to life. There's an order in chapter 1 and chapter 2 if you look at it. What is the order? At the very first thing, this is where you respond. At the very first thing, what's there? God. Sorry, maybe it's a trick question. Maybe so. God has to be on top of everything, okay? There's only like 4 characters pretty much in Genesis 1 and 2. God, and then Adam, right? Right next to Adam is Eve. And then what are they supposed to do? They're supposed to rule over creation. 4 things. God, man, woman, creation. You see that? That's what Genesis 2 and paradise is established. But then what happens in Genesis 3? What happens by the end of Genesis 3? You see the order is flipped, right? The serpent comes to Eve and starts whispering to her, and then she sins. She gives that fruit to Adam, and then Adam falls. And then when God calls Adam, what does he do? He hides. What's the order now after Genesis 3? Creation, woman, man, God. Complete disorder. It's the complete reversal of how God made it. You have to see the imagery there. And then so this is this chaotic and upside down reverse world that we live in. That's what we always talk about, we live in a fallen world. We live in a sinful world. Well, why is it that? Because we flipped everything. When Paul in Romans 1 says you worship creation, that's why. Because we follow the devil. We follow that serpent. And we live in that imagery where the serpent rules, then our man and women, and then God. That's what it is. It's flipped. It should be God first. So therefore, how does this relate to our passage? Injustice is just a byproduct of this chaotic and upside down and broken world. That's what it is. That's why injustice happens. That's why other things happen too, but just for our topic today, injustice happens because we live in this world. Adam sinned, we are in Adam, and we all fell, and the world is like that. Look at verse 2. Paul's talking to these people that he's accusing them, and he's like, how long will you love vain words and seek after lies? This means, how long will you go for emptiness? How long will you go for worthlessness? How long will you believe the lies of Satan? You see what I'm saying? Injustice is a byproduct of this, meaning it doesn't happen directly. People don't wake up and be like, I just want to hurt people today, okay? Man, like a segment of very, very bad, very evil people. It's not, but injustice doesn't happen like that. It's not like, I get up and I just want to make a whole mess out of life. That's not what injustice does. What does injustice do why does injustice happen? Is because we follow ourselves, or we follow the ways of the world, when we should be following God. And so when we follow something else other than God, then we start ending up hurting people. Here's what I mean. Remember I told you that story about Glenn Ford, right? The prosecutor in that case was a man by the name of Marty Shroud. The main reason that Glenn Ford got sentenced for 30 years in death row for a crime that he didn't commit was Marty Shroud. At the time of the case, Marty Shroud was 33. And he was an ambitious lawyer. He wanted to move up. How do you move up as a prosecutor in the system? You just got to win. Get prosecutions, and then you go, And so death row, that's kind of good publicity at the time, For a guy who murdered somebody, I put this man in jail. I convicted him. You see what I'm saying? So the reputation is building that way. He was ambitious. At that 60 Minutes piece a couple years ago that CBS did, you know what he described himself as? He says, Marty Shroud described himself as arrogant, judgmental, narcissistic. He was apologizing. He's sorry. Of course he's sorry. He ruined a man's life. So he's sorry. But he looked reflecting on himself. He calls himself narcissistic. He said he was full of himself because all he cared about was winning cases at the time. You see, it's not the fact that Marty Shroud woke up and was like, I'm going to ruin somebody's life today. It is the fact that when you follow after things that are not of God, then injustice starts happening. And we start hurting each other. You see what I'm saying? Looking back on the case, they said that the evidence against Glenn Ford, it was circumstantial, not good, right? And there was a witness testimony, unreliable, it says. But despite all that, Marty Shroud was like, forget it. I'm going to get this. I'm going to pin it on this guy. And he goes and he does it. Why? He's following the world. He's following his own ambitions. He wants to go and improve his own life. He's following after vain words. He's following after these lies, you see? And then therefore, injustice happens. Why do we hurt each other? It's because we don't follow after God, right? The Apostle John, in his letter, he wrote that perfect love drives out fear. Perfect love drives out fear. Church, you have been given the perfect love that secures you. And so we twist it. It's not about not being ambitious. Go after stuff. Improve your status in your company, go after awards, absolutely. But you do it, it's secured in the love of God. That's what it is. You don't try to get these awards, and you don't try to get this status, and you don't try to get all this money, and so that you can love yourself. You know that you are already loved, so you do the best you can. That's the correct thing. But when we don't have God, then we're empty, and we got to make something of ourselves. So we start searching for this stuff. You know what happens? Then other people are just in opposition. They're a stepping stone. And so we treat people like that, and we stomp on people. And then what happens? Injustice. So this is where injustice happens. If you're tracking with me, I believe that I haven't said anything radical. It's not like, it's mind-blowing. Like other people have said this before. There's commentaries written on this. There's books written on this. We're all adults here. We've all experienced life, right? And we've all experienced some form of injustice like this. I don't think it's like we're so naive to think like it's like, injustice will never happen to you, right? It will come. In life, it will come. So it's like, it's not an issue of if, but when. When it comes, what do we do then, right? We know that we live in a fallen world, and injustice is a byproduct of the fallen world. So when it happens to us, not if, but when, what do we do? What do we do? Second point, how should we respond as Christians? As with many lessons taught in the Bible, believers start with God. You start everything with God. Everything with God. Make it a point as you wake up in the morning and you pray, you think about God. The first thing you do, the last thing you do at night. I know it sounds silly, but this is how we orient ourselves into thinking about Him. In troubled times, in times of despair, in times of joy, in times of celebration, everything is in God. Who we turn to in our time of need shows who our God is, right? We talked about that before in John. Who we turn to in our time of need is who our God is. Who does David turn to? Look at the first line of verse 1. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. He calls out to God, right? His innocence, his honor has been turned to shame. He has done nothing wrong. And what does he do? God, help me out. That's what he does. That's the very first thing that we should do, always. Furthermore, notice how how David approaches God. He doesn't just, when we complain, we're like wildly, like we just say, grab stuff, and we talk about everything. David's kind of systematic with this stuff, okay? Notice the subtleties of how he approaches God with this shame that he has to deal with. One, he doesn't disregard his own sin. Look at the last line of verse 1. In the ESV, there's 3 lines. Look at the last line of verse 1. It says, "Be gracious to me and hear my prayer." That gracious word in the NIV and the King James Version, it can be also translated as mercy. He's asking God for mercy. Why is David asking God for mercy? I just told you guys he's innocent, right? He didn't do anything to bring this upon himself. But why is he asking for mercy? He's asking for mercy because he knows he's not perfect. That's why. Right? In this instance, he's innocent, but in his whole life, he knows he's a sinner, and he knows he's not perfect. And so the first thing he does is call after God. The second thing he does, he confesses his sins to him. That's why we do confession, because we must do it. We must cleanse ourselves like this, because God knows everything. And so he understands that he's not perfect. He didn't earn this right to go after God. It is because God's grace that he forgives him, that the king allows David to come approach him. So he says, "Be gracious to me. Have mercy on me." Romans 3:23, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." 1 John 1:8 and 10, "If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we say we have not sinned, we make him, Jesus, a liar, and his word is not in us." The Bible clearly teaches that everybody has sin. But I don't need to tell you that. I don't need to quote Bible for you to understand that. We all know that we sin. We all know that life is hard. We sin constantly. It's not a perfection thing, right? And so we understand that. So if we are not perfect, then what right do we have to approach God? How do we approach God, right? For David, it is the anticipation of the Messiah to come. It is by faith he approaches. For us, it is in remembrance of what Jesus does. And that's why. In times of when you are assailed through injustice and all this kind of stuff, we must remember to call upon God, and we must remember our own sins too. It is not by our faith, it's not by our actions, it is not by our effort, it is not by our merit that we approach God with these complaints, with all these things. You got to remember, maybe in that moment you've been innocent, but your whole life you haven't. And so we got to cleanse ourselves. We got to ask God for mercy. 2, David remembers his faithfulness, God's faithfulness. We sang of it last week, right? Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. The devil will continue to lie to us, right? In Genesis 3, how did the devil lie to Eve? The devil lied to Eve by saying, God doesn't care about you. Eat this fruit. That's what it is, essentially. God doesn't give a crap about you. God doesn't care about you. God only cares about himself. That's the lies. And so why do we sin? Why do we go after these things? Because it's like, God, you don't have what's in my best interest. Because you keep telling me to give, you keep telling me to sacrifice, and it doesn't make any sense. See, the devil is constantly whispering into our ear, telling us that he doesn't like us, that he doesn't care about us. He only cares about himself. You see? But in those moments, just like David, we got to remember his faithfulness. Remember the times that he's been faithful to you, that he's delivered you. Look in the middle line in the ESV of verse 1. You have given me relief. You have given me relief when I was in distress. It is not by works or by random chance, but it was you, O Lord, who saved me. Look at verse 3. But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself, and the Lord hears when I call to him. God never lets go. Once you are his, there is nothing that can separate his love from you. So when we endure injustice, when we are assailed, when we are innocent, when we face horrible trials of this life, we can say that God will always be faithful to us in this life. You see, you must remember, church. We're going to go through certain times of dryness. We're going to go through certain trials and stuff. But we must remember the God we worship. We must remember his faithfulness. A lifetime with God is a lifetime of evidence of why he's so faithful. Think about it from David's life, right? Scholars don't exactly know if he wrote this, right? The subscription says a Psalm of David, or it could be a Psalm to David. We don't know. We think that David wrote this most likely. So let's say it was David that wrote this, right? Like what story in his life could he draw from? What memory, right? Do you remember? Was it a time that David had victory from Goliath, right? This giant man and all these grown men when he was a boy, right? And they're running away because they're scared, right? Was it that time? Was it a time when David was hiding in caves because Saul was jealous of him and wanted to kill him, and God delivered him too? Was it the time that Samuel, prophet Samuel, came and looked over all his brothers, all his older brothers who are older and wiser and stronger than him? And then he says, not you, not you. Looks at David and says, this is the one, and anoints him. All these times when God was faithful in David's life. And so when he faces trials like this, although he's hurt, although the emotions are coursing through his mind and body and all this stuff, he can be like, God was faithful to me all this life, and he is faithful. He will be faithful in this time too. A lot of times we quit. We're like children. We're like children, right? It's always like that. Like me teaching SATs, teaching kids, tutoring kids, coaching basketball, all kids want to do is quit. It's too hard. I don't want to do it anymore. How do we act like that? Guys, this is too hard. I don't want to do it anymore. I got to give more and more and more. And it's like, God's like, no, you handle it. I got you. And this is how we grow. We must continue on and remember his faithfulness. Do you see what he's doing here? You see what's going on? When you remember your own sins, you become humble, right? When you remember God's faithfulness, you are secure in him. And when you are humbled, and when you are secure in him, guess what you can do? You can love your enemies. I think this is one of the hardest things, right? What do you mean turn the other cheek? What do you mean give them my coat? What are you talking about love your enemies? Honestly, how many times have you loved your enemies? You know, it's incredible, right? Like you hear stories about, like, you know, somebody kills your wife or child in a car accident like that, and then they show up at the funeral and they publicly say, I forgive them. Like, how do you do that? Could you imagine like what that parent or that spouse is going through? Right? You ripped away like my love from my life, and you can say you love them. It's not Christian to be like, yes, love your enemy. No! Of course you're angry. If you're not angry, you never loved your wife in the first place. If you're not angry, then you won't love your kids that much. You get what I'm saying? It's not to kill your emotions. Even in these emotions, how do we forgive people? It's those two things, humility and security. Remember, you're not perfect either. Just because you didn't kill somebody or you didn't do anything great doesn't mean we never hurt anybody either. That's one. Two, if we remember God's faithfulness, he will secure us. Remember where your future is headed. It is into the new heavens and the new earth, and with Christ, with God, that relationship. You see what I'm saying? When we're secure in him and we are humble, then we can pray for our enemies. And that's what David does. That's what David does. He turns. The psalm is weird. He was like talking to God, and then he starts talking to his people. And then you're like, what's going on? He's praying for them. He's praying for them. We must love our enemies, right? We know that. Matthew 5:43-45, Jesus says, you have heard that it was said you should love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. If you love your enemies, you pray for those who persecute you, that is evidence of your adoption to God. That's hard stuff to hear. That's hard stuff to hear, right? Because like a lot of times we fall short. Although we know this, we've heard this, as many of us have gone to church, we don't know how to do it. How to do it, humble yourself and secure in his love, right? As well as, how do we pray for them? We pray that they know God. We pray that they become saved. That's his logic is straightforward, right? Why does injustice happen? Injustice happens because we don't follow after God, and these people are blaming us and stuff. So how do we stop this blame? Well, if they're saved, then they'll stop hating on us, and so the injustice will stop. That's what he's doing. He's not talking about, kill them. He's not talking about protect me or make them move away and all this stuff. He goes right at the core. How do we stop injustice? If everybody's saved, and if everybody's a true believer and a true follower of God, then injustice should stop, right? That's logical, and that's where David is getting at. Look at verse 4. Be angry, do not sin. Ponder in your hearts on your beds, and be silent. That angry, that's not an angry word like anger in English. It's some translator, it's tough. Some translators say it's tremble. Be in honor of God. Acknowledge him. That's what I mean. And so you see that verse 4 makes sense, right? If you tremble, do not sin. Think about it in your quietness of your heart and be silent. What that means is acknowledge who God is, right? David is urging his detractors to know your place. Look at verse 5. And not only do you acknowledge God, you worship him. Offering sacrifices, that is worship. Put your trust in God. It's not just acknowledging him, it's trusting him as well. Church, we must pray for our enemies. We must pray for those who harm us even when we are innocent. We must pray that they get to meet God and turn their lives over to him. Do you know why? Because we're no different. We're no different than them. We've hurt other people. We've all been on that side where we weren't saved. That's the power of the gospel. You see the power of the gospel? It unites us in sin. It unites us in Jesus. It's incredible. What is David getting at in this psalm? My wife yells at me all the time because I don't want to hear the story. I just want to hear the bottom line. Okay, what happened? Right? She's like, I was with my mom calling. No. What happened? What happened? You got into a car accident? What happened? Like stuff like that. I like bottom lines. What's the bottom line? What is David getting at here? We've discussed why injustice happens. We discussed David's response to injustice. What's the bottom line? What's the remedy for injustice? Again, it's not a big secret. This psalm offers no theoretical or practical help. It doesn't offer anything. David's life hasn't changed at all. Like his opponents hasn't died, or he hasn't moved away, or there's nothing that happens. But there's a change. You see how David, look at the end. It says, there are many who say, verse 6, who will show us some good. Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. And he goes, you have put more joy in my heart than I have when their grain and wine abound. You see how his soul is uplifted. That's all it is. How? Why? Why does this David outlook change? Because he remembers that God is with him. That's what it is. Are you joyed this morning because God is with you? Even in times of trouble, even in trial, even in difficulty, we know that everything is okay because God is with you. That's the bottom line. That's the bottom line. See, the circumstances, it's not about external. It's always about internal. Your life, my pastoring of you, our ministry, I just want you in here to grow. Because the outside I cannot control. The outside you can't control either. Right? Look at verse 8. He remembers God is with him. You alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. You see that? You see the beauty of that statement? Whether everybody's against him or whether everybody's celebrating David. Whether he is in the palace sleeping or whether he's sleeping on a rock in a cave, he says, I am okay. Why? Because you're with me. You're with me. You see the connection to Genesis 3? Disorder happens because of our broken relationship with God. In Genesis 3, Adam hides. Where are you, Adam? And he hides. David is assailed. And what does he do? You're with me. I'm okay. You see that? This is the hope of Christ. He saw the disorder and the depravity, saw the sinfulness of ourselves, and he didn't just let things go. 2,000 some odd years ago, he sent his son. He sent his son. He was born of the Virgin, and his name was Emmanuel, God with us. He is with us. He is with us. He lived and died and resurrected so that you can rise above these things, that empowers you over this injustice, over anything that we face. Church, we can have the same confidence in David. Injustice will happen in our lives. It is guaranteed, right? Even as our ministry grows and as we develop, we're going to face different trials. We're going to face things that people are like, wait, why did you just do that? People are just gross, man. Like, they're so evil sometimes. Like we got nothing else better to do. How do we face it? It's because God is with us. And as long as we cling to Him, you see, remember Psalm 1, it's not the external, it's the internal. You're planted by streams of water. In season, we produce fruit, and our leaf does not wither. Why does that happen? Not because of climate control, but because we're planted by streams of water, and we are planted in Him. I close with the words of Paul in Philippians 4. He says, I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound in any and every circumstance, he says. I've learned the secret to facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. He says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can do all things with Christ who strengthens me, even in trial or in joy. Why? Because He's with me. Church, He is with us. Continue on in your walk with Him. Let's close our time. I ask you to pray in your seats and think about the message. Think about your lives. You know your life better than anybody else. How does this apply to you? What is God telling you? What is God showing you? Let's reflect on that.